actually only our second edition. And this year it's a collaboration between the International Development Societies of LSE, UCL, and Csos. We're also sponsored by Chemonics International, with whom we had a workshop with this afternoon right before the panel. So the organizing team and I are very proud to present you with this event. We've been working on it for like the past several months, and we've been working very hard to organize this during COVID. So we really wish we could have welcomed you all on campus as we did last year. But the silver lining of this online panel is that we have speakers and attendees from all over the world, which would not have been possible if we had done the symposium in London. So we're very excited about this, and we hope you enjoy this and that we can have you all on campus next year for the third symposium. And now I'll pass it over to the chair.
Great. Thank you very much, Ombeline, and welcome everyone to our panel tonight. This is the panel called Governance and Development, Strengthening Democratic Institutions. I'm Catherine Boone. I'm a professor of government and international development at LSE, and I'm very happy to chair the panel because the topic is indeed close to my disciplinary and my research interests. I'd like to say a few words about the panel first and then introduce the speakers and open the discussion. So the panel was originally conceived in terms of a discussion about the impact of regime type on development. So the relationship between institutions, citizens, citizen activism, and development. And indeed, it taps into some of the most enduring debates in political science and development studies. So as many of you know, there are advocates of developmental authoritarianism who say that really authoritarian regimes are best suited to foster economic development because they're more decisive, they can act more quickly, they can avoid the sorts of compromises and side deals that may impede fast and decisive decision-making. They can get around veto players. But on the other hand, there are proponents of good governance who argue that actually more inclusive, more democratic, non-corrupt government is a necessary, perhaps even prior condition for development, and especially necessary for sustainable development. These democratic regimes may not be the most efficient, but they're more inclusive, and importantly, they may be able to avoid great harm to society in their more inclusive and deliberative decision-making. So as Amartya Sen has argued famously, famines do not happen in democracies. So our panelists are going to help us think about this tonight. Is there a sequence between democracy and economic development? One must come before the other. Is there a higher good between democracy and development? Is there a trade-off? And what does citizen activism have to do with it? Where do civil society organizations come in? What is their role? How do we factor that into our understanding of the relationship between institutions, government, and development? And to talk with us tonight and help frame the issues, we have a very interesting and diverse panel of speakers. And let me just very briefly introduce each one to you. Our first speaker is going to be Jacopo Leone, who is Chief of Democratic Governance and Gender Unit for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. What he'll talk about tonight is a general sort of overview of the state of democracy since 1990 from a global perspective, and maybe focusing on examples from the OSCE region. His own research and expertise is focused over time on anti-corruption, inclusive political participation, and issues of drafting of legislation and implementation on the part of democratic governments. Our second speaker is Richard John. He is Senior Election Expert at the European Center for Electoral Support. He's worked for decades with fragile and conflict-affected states with government and democracy programming. He's going to talk to us about civil society organizations and from a very interesting background, a career in the British Army, followed by election service in many countries around around the world. Our third panelist is going to be Cvete Koneska. She comes from the world of risk analysis and consulting. She leads political risk and security political risk and security analysis team at SRM, which is a risk and intelligence consultancy. Her experience has focused in the past on the Balkans, but she's going to speak more broadly tonight about the possible trade-off and synergies between good governance and economic development, speaking largely about business interests perspective on this issue. Do investors and multinational corporations consider governance, and if so, how? And our final speaker on the panel is Jean Scrimgeour. She is the Director for Operations and Growth at the Accountability Lab, which is a global network dedicated to making good governance work for people by supporting active citizenship. And that's precisely what she's going to talk about tonight. Prior to joining the lab, she's worked as public affairs and a democratic governance specialist in the US, UK, and South Africa. So another panelist with really wide-ranging experience. So that is my introduction. All four of our panelists are going to speak sort of about these broad issues from the perspective of their practical work in these areas. And we know that many of you tonight are interested in careers that are related to the subjects we're talking about tonight. And so our speakers may also have things to add on that aspect of the matter. So for the ground rules, will be as follows. Each of our speakers will have about 10 to 12 minutes. While they're speaking, you are free to add comments in the chat. And you're also invited to put questions in the Q&A panel. And we'd especially like to encourage you to think of questions that sort of span the panel and that we can ask all of our speakers to address in the interest of getting some cross-fertilization and discussion going across the speakers who come to the subject at hand with really very, very different backgrounds and different perspectives. So with that, as long as there is no further logistical or operational issues to address, with that, I'm very happy to turn the floor over to Jacopo Leone from the OSCE to talk about, to give us a kind of overview of this, if in 10 to 12 minutes, of the state of democracy in the world today. Jacopo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor, and good evening, everybody. It's really a big pleasure to be here with you. I really hope to have a fruitful discussion and to touch upon these topics that are indeed extremely relevant, not only for our work, the work that we do in the OSCE, but I believe for all of us, whatever is the approach that we take on the issue of democracy and development. Let me also just thank you also the organizers. I know that it's not easy to put together these kinds of conferences in today's challenging context. We face similar problems in our work, so I really want to commend their work. They've been incredibly professional. As you mentioned, Professor, I come from the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And more specifically from the independent office within the OSCE, which is called the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, by the acronym of ODIHR. You might have heard for the work that we do in monitoring electoral processes, and among that we do also other things dealing more directly with the promotion of human rights and democratic institutions and fundamental freedoms. The OSCE as an organization, just as a quick intro, covers 57 participating states. Basically, this covers the entire Northern Hemisphere, the United States, Canada, the entire European continent, and all the post-Soviet countries, including Mongolia, which is the last participating state that was added to the organization a few years ago. You know, going back to the dichotomy that you were mentioning, Professor, between democracy and development, I would rather focus on the first part of that dichotomy. So really looking at the issue of democracy and, as you said, the quality of democracy within the OSCE region, but also globally. And why is that? Because democracy is really at the core of the OSCE work and its soul, basically. The OSCE is an organization that is founded on the principle of comprehensive security. It is a security intergovernmental body, but that idea of security rests on the need of having three equally important pillars in place, which is the first one, the military aspect of security. The second is the economic and environmental aspect of security. And the third one, the one that deals with indeed democracy and human rights. So all the 57 participating states of the OSCE 30 years ago committed in Paris to build and consolidate and strengthen democracy as the only system of government for our nations. It is a beautiful, actually, document, the Charter of Paris. I really encourage all of you to look at it and to read it. It's a beautiful, beautiful ode, if you want, to the issue and the concept of democracy. Following that, in the same year, in the 1990, the delegations of the OSCE, the 57 participating states, gathered in Copenhagen to also draft additional commitments, additional principles that all of them were pledging to follow. And this was really a significant moment, because as you can easily imagine, in the 90s, the world was going through a very dramatic and transformative time in terms of the concept of democracy worldwide. And what was reached during that conference in Copenhagen and the document that resulted from it is really at the core of the work that we do in ODIHR. It was presented at the time by the Soviet head of the negotiating team as the new European constitution, which I always find very interesting to note. And the document, the Copenhagen document, really contains an abundance of unprecedented, if you want, commitments and pledges to, you know, free and democratic elections, the right of national minorities, freedom of association, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, all the fundamental freedoms. And all these states, all the 57, really pledged to embrace these and to protect them and to advance them in their own societies. So an incredibly important document. But what really makes it special, perhaps, and so relevant today in the world that we live in, I think it's also the originality for a security organization that actually indeed binds human rights commitments to a system of government that needs to be democratic, it needs to be pluralistic, it needs to be characterized by the rule of law. So that was a first in history, never happened before. But those obviously were the optimistic years, if you want, right? When ODIHR was also founded, my office that I mentioned at the beginning, we actually were founded to help the participating states reaching those objectives and those commitments on democracy and human rights. And, you know, in those years in the 90s, we obviously saw a surge of new democracies. The values of liberal democracy seemed to be widely accepted across the globe. The perception was indeed the history would, you know, from now on go in only one direction and without any backsliding. Since the 90s, many things have changed, as you well know, and indeed democracy is today facing serious and substantial challenges as never before, I would argue, or at least from our own perspective as an office working on these issues. And here, perhaps, I think the truth is that democracy has been developing some worrying underlying conditions for some decades now. Making it extremely fragile. This is not new. This is not a news of the last few years. Democracy has in many ways today, it is a sick patient that, having gone through a decade of decline and even more and backsliding, as many centers and research are telling us out there, like Freedom House, for example. Another one is the research that VDEM, the Variety of Democracy Research Center in the University of Gothenburg, which, you know, if you're not familiar with it, I would really encourage you to go and consult. They do an amazing work with an incredible number of data points. They labeled this trend the third wave of autocratization, which translates into, yes, a shrinking number of democratic countries all over the world in the last decade, but more importantly, I would say, not on an exponentially bigger number, into an exponentially bigger number of people living in societies in which democracy is weakening or in decline. So 1/3 of the world, if you look at the data provided by VDEM, entering into these 21st century in some kind of degree of authoritarian society, and that's already 2.5 billion people. So this is a real problem, a real concern. And looking at the countries which have seen the sharpest decline in democratic traits, you see the US, you see India, you see Turkey, you see Poland. So a very populous country in which a considerable number of people are living within. So if we break down this democratic backsliding, which is out there, has been reported quite widely, and we zoom in, then I think we can see that all major indicators are affected. So electoral quality of electoral processes, functioning of government, civil liberties, all these key features of democracy have been declining in recent years, as was also shown by, for example, lately I was reading the new democracy index of The Economist. There, it's another proof of this widespread declining in the fundamental traits of democratic society. Perhaps with one exception, which I always seem to find, which is the one of political participation. At the time of great mistrust for traditional democratic institutions, try to ask your friends or parents or families, do you trust political parties? Do you trust parliaments? Do you trust leaders? The answer is probably no. This growing participation takes often a form of protest. And that's why political participation is one of those indicators that it always seems to improve in a sense. And this participation, though, takes the form of protests, rallies, marches. Think about Friday for Future, for example, marches all over the world. The Yellow Vest a few years ago in France, anti-corruption protests in many of our countries, OSCE region, Romania, Slovakia, Czech Republic, often with a very disruptive impact on the ability of those governments to continue working. So although a positive sign, of course, in any healthy democratic life, I think this increased political participation, because of its form and its nature in the end, is telling us a more complex, I think, story. It tells us that on a very solid ground, we have a fundamental problem with the way our democratic institutions work and their perception by the citizens. I think it tells us that taking the streets to voice concerns is the result of that deepening distrust towards governments, the decision-making process, their ability to really answer our needs. And again, if I have to go out and look at research, it comes to mind the latest Edelman barometer on trust, where governments are actually seen by the wide majority as both incompetent and unethical, with many other surveys indicating that executive, parliaments, politicians are suffering a steady decline in level of trust by the citizens. And I think, I'm not going to touch on it. You mentioned, Professor, in my introduction, that we do a lot of work on corruption and public integrity. And I think corruption here has certainly been playing a strong role in that mistrust that we have towards public institutions and resulting kind of dissatisfaction with the idea of democracy. Episodes of political corruption, recurring scandals over the years, we can all name a few, I believe, from our own countries. I think they have contributed to a growing distrust, offering a clear correlation, if you want, between trust in governments and perceived level of corruption in our societies, as also, for example, the OECD data and research indicates quite well. So this is, I think, from what we can see from our own perspective and work, the state of democracy today in our countries, very fragile, weak democratic institutions, marked by a lack of trust in those in power governing us. So I think, look at the latest developments. We were just working in the past few weeks with the governments and parliamentarians in Georgia, in Armenia, those countries that you would assume being in the right direction of growing democratic values and growing democratic practices. All of a sudden, everything is put into question, whether those democratic institutions and processes will be strong enough to resist and survive. So how do we move forward from here? Yeah, is quite a bleak picture, if you want, but obviously there is a lot of positive as well, I believe. I think the first thing we need to do is to remind ourselves that democratic culture is not created overnight, and democratic governance structures do take time to develop, and every context has a different setup. So building institutions, which is actually what we try to do as an organization, really takes time, and there is no quick fix, right? There is no silver bullet to really do it. But what is important in that long process is indeed to keep in mind that it's crucial that we pay attention to ensure that we stick to the respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms. I don't think there is any success for any regime, whatever kind of level of democratic life you want to attach to it, to really be efficient if you don't have those human rights and fundamental freedoms respected. I saw the message, Professor. I'll conclude very quickly. I just wanted to mention, maybe as a note, that I think COVID-19 didn't help this process. I think it really showed even more those cracks within our democratic institutions. Time is up indeed, but I would just encourage the participants, if they have the time and interest, to go on our website, the ODIHR website. We produced a report last year really evaluating and assessing the impact that COVID-19 had on the respect of fundamental freedoms and human rights in our region. It's a long report, many sections, but I believe and indeed a very interesting read. So I would conclude maybe on a positive. I think there is a lot of space to improve the situation. It's not going to be easy, but I believe it really depends on us if we want to take that ownership, if we want to feel once again, perhaps, that democracy is something that we all need to chip in, we all need to contribute to, and you as students, as civil actors, which I think have already experience in advancing democratic forms of governance and participation in your own lives. You need to take charge. We all need to take that charge to rebuild the confidence in our systems and to really keep accountable governments and parliaments to do the right thing. And many positive developments are pointing in that way. We just need to embrace them and really believe in them, I think. I'll stop there, Professor, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for really a broad reaching tour of the horizon, all the way from the Charter of Paris in the early 90s to this strange, murky kind of surge in participation that is kind of in deeply ambiguous interaction with the forces of democracy. So, and that was a kind of very provocative and interesting way of laying out the state that we're in today. So with that, I would like to turn the floor over to Richard John, who is going to pick up actually exactly where we are right now, emphasizing, among other things, civil society organizations. So Richard.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for Jacopo. Just to say, we hadn't rehearsed this beforehand, but I could not have asked for a better introduction to my subject. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you for the organizing committee. 10 minutes on the role of civil society organizations within democracy, within a government, within a developmental context. A little bit more about me to help people understand where this is coming from. The last 25 years of working in governance and democracy programs in 24 fragile and conflict-affected states. This includes 4 years with the OSCE in Bosnia and Herzegovina and 2 years with them in Kosovo. I've also worked in UK elections. So arguably, the advancement of democracy is one of the most important aspects of development. It comes hard on the heels of education and citizen services. Big budgets have been spent that reflect this case. Going back to OSCE Bosnia in 1996, the budget was 150 million US. That's a lot of money today, a staggering amount of money quarter of a century ago. We spent even more than that in 1997, employing 400 international voter registration supervisors and 2,300 polling station supervisors. That's in addition to the hundreds of us that were working there as long-term staff. Contrast that against a decade later in Iraq, my non-election year, just ticking over, doing capacity building, doing institutional development, 38 million US in 1 year. These are big numbers, but they're all cast into the shade. By 2009 Afghan elections, somewhere between 300 and 500 million US in direct costs. These big numbers would have you thinking that long-term opportunities in the electoral development world will be abundant. However, long-term success stories from international elections are few and far between. I'm still an advocate of one person, one vote. I still put myself in harm's way to bring this to people. However, it's my personal and humble belief that elections are a byproduct of democracy and that it's civil society organizations, CSOs as I'll be referring to them, that drive the democratic process. It's CSOs that hold elected and appointed officials to account. And this to me is the absolute heart of democracy. Anyone who's thinking of moving into the electoral world as a career should first read Roland Paris at War's End. He significantly criticizes in his assessment of the impact of he's significantly critical in his assessment of 14 peace-building operations between 1989 and 1999 and their electoral processes. The lack of long-term success from Afghanistan and Iraqi elections indicates that the author of those peace-building plans had not learned that the lessons that Paris provided us. It's my personal view that large-scale election support programs are going to be limited in the future. For example, this year, the US government are giving just 10 million to the Iraqi elections scheduled for October. I also believe that the role that CSOs play in democratization has been undervalued, and it's an area that will see progressive expansion in the future. CSO development projects have become more common on the job boards in the last 6 to 12 months. These are usually grant-based projects. I can expand upon that in the Q&A session if there's an interest in discussing that. Meanwhile, we've got civic activism movements. Some were referred to by Jacopo. There's also examples such as Bring Back Our Girls from Nigeria, Me Too coming out of the US and the film and TV industry, Black Lives Matter. These have helped people better understand the wider role of CSOs in governance and democracy. So, simple example, CSO versus civic activism. Recent report from a USAID funded program in Sudan. It stated that while a unified periphery-driven civic activism movement drove the 2019 revolution, civil society is fragmenting under the complexities of the transition. Political discussions are once again dominated by cartoon-centric views and are minimally representative of women and youth. Civil society must be strengthened in these areas to ensure an all-inclusive political process and to hold the government accountable to the milestones in the Constitutional Charter and the decisions of the electoral process. On a wider basis, the Brookings Institute informs us about CSOs. Civil society organizations play multiple roles. They're an important source of information for both citizens and government. They monitor government policies and actions and hold government accountable. They engage in advocacy and offer alternate policies for government, the private sector, and other institutions. They deliver services, especially to the poor and the underserved. They defend citizens' rights and work to change and uphold social norms and behaviors. Henry Volkmeier offers us, in normative terms, civil society has been widely seen as a critical agent for limiting authoritarian government, empowering a popular movement, reducing the socially atomizing and unsettling effects of market forces, enforcing political accountability, and improving the quality of inclusive governance. So what drives the CSOs? Where do they come from? What's the source? Lepgold and Nincic, from their book Beyond the Ivory Towers, points us towards CSOs being driven by the middle classes, with those middle classes emerging from a free market economy. My definition as a layperson, CSOs are driven by people with disposable income and disposable time. So free time, free money. Where I am at the moment, Ethiopia, we're getting ready for elections on the 5th of June. The population here is 80% rural, with many of those 80% engaged in dawn till dusk agricultural pastoral activities. They've got little time for civic engagement on a sustained basis. There's ample literature out there that suggests countries with low individual GDP struggle with democratic processes. And if I had the time and the money to read a PhD, the correlation I would like to explore, it's already been explored, low GDP, lack of sustainable democracy. I want to put the CSO bit into the middle and to study that and to find out if there's causality and correlation. So in short, many of the fragile and conflict affected states where internationally supported elections take place don't have a middle class. They don't have homegrown CSOs. Returning to Voltmeier, civil society is viewed as an agency for bringing about a participatory and empowering form of development, an organizational means of transforming the new development paradigm into practice. Now, I've engaged with CSOs in every country I've worked in for the last 15 years. These countries are, by correlation of my work there, lower to middle income countries and or they're fragile and conflict affected states. There's not really the free market economy. There's not really the middle class. If there's no middle class to drive CSOs, who does? You've heard earlier of the enormous amounts of money of getting the ballot to the people. So why don't donors give money to CSOs in the same volume? Well, we need to fill that void created by the lack of middle class, even if it is commercially driven civil society organizations. Why not? Well, my personal belief is that the donors are obsessed with 5-year log frames, and you have to be able to demonstrate on your log frame activity, output, impact. Without that, you don't get the funding. CSO development is not clear cut. Impact can be a challenge to quantify. It can be a challenge to measure. So strengthening democratic institutions, the subject of our seminar, without strengthening CSOs holds limited value, in my humble opinion. However, change is afoot. The United States Agency for Development is embracing CLA. Please learn this expression, CLA, collaborating, learning, adapting. There was even a recent call for proposals in Ethiopia for a problem-driven approach to programming. Problem-driven programming has been with us for a while through the use of problem-driven iterative adaptation, PDIA. Andrew Pritchard's 2012 paper with the Center for Global Development addresses the title, How to Escape from Capability Traps. More recently, 2018, Harvard University's Building State Capacity Center for International Development references PDIA. We will be able to use PDIA in the development of CSOs. We just need the donors to make the leap forward to understanding that log frames don't necessarily work for CSO development. They need to embrace the understanding that impact may not be seen or measured for decades, and that some money will be wasted. Not all plans will work out. Multiple pilot projects, I believe, are the way ahead. Well, yes, there will still be international electoral roles, but I believe they're more likely to move towards smaller teams, 4, 5, 6. Old hands like me, people who are returning officers or electoral commissioners from their own home countries and constituencies, giving something back to the international community when they've retired. With a growing sense of democracy failures at home and abroad, as referenced by Jacopo, thank you for that. If you're keen to explore options for development work in international governance and democracy programming, you may want to look towards civil society development. How do you do that? identify a niche within the programming of CSO development. Maybe it's a thematic area, which is one of your areas of expertise. Maybe it's what you wrote your thesis on. Technical oversight of grant processes is very similar to procurement management. Technical coaching for the CSOs, finance, proposal writing, reporting, method of instruction, because there's always a need for training of trainers in some shape or form. Organizational leadership and management is another key area. Monitoring and evaluation for the CSO of the CSOs. These are other key areas where there is going to be a growth in work. So, in summary, democracy, in my opinion, is all about CSOs. It's not about elections. Elections are critical, but they're not the driving force. Elections will remain an important part, but the big budget days of 300 million, 500 million Afghanistan, they're gone. That's not going to happen again. There will be an ongoing need for democracy development programming, but I believe there's going to be a shift towards CSO development through grant-based PDIA and CLA systems. Now, if you want to get into this game, having a certificate in CLA or PDIA project skills may be favorable on your CV. And if anyone can please find out where to get one, can you let me know? Because I'm desperate to get myself certified in something that I practice on a daily basis. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the Q&A session, and I hope I'm just on the 10-minute mark. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Richard. And I think the kind of historical arc that you've traced in funding and the types of endeavors that have been financed and supported over time is really interesting and adds a lot of weight and credibility to what you say about CSOs. It also raises a lot of questions that I hope we can pursue in the Q&A. You know, including the question I'm thinking of right now is how, you know, can CSOs operate in non-democratic contexts? You know, what about the situations where CSOs are so constrained that they can't function? But anyway, that will be a question that we can pick up later. I also want to draw everyone's attention to the resources and websites that are mentioned in the chat bar. Some of the material that Jacopo has posted while Richard was talking will be of interest to you all. So with that, I'm very excited to turn the floor over to Cvete Koneska. I told you before, she leads the political risk and security analysis team at SRM, a risk and intelligence consultancy, and she will come at this from a completely different but highly relevant and important angle. So Cvete, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Catherine, and thank you to the organizing committee for putting this panel together. But most of all, thank you to all the participants who have joined on a Friday evening to listen to our discussion. Now, I know, well, depending where you are, there are not many places you can go on a Friday evening as a student, but nonetheless, I am very flattered that so many of you have turned up to listen and hopefully join our discussion. This is a topic that the democracy and development debate is a topic that I've been kind of interested in for a very long time, coming from a region that has struggled with governance and democratic reforms for a very long time, on the kind of democratic as well as a post-conflict nature. Obviously that has kind of shaped how I have evolved as a professional, but also a student of politics and a researcher of politics. But I'm not going to, as tempting as it is, I'm not going to go tonight into the discussion of, you know, the quality of governance in post-conflict states, especially in the Balkans, which is an area which I've followed for a very long time. But what I propose to do is to address the question that the chair has raised at the start and kind of think about the dichotomy, or rather the trade-offs involved between economic development and democratic governance. What I have done over the past 10 years, it's been a long while since I left academia and went into the consulting sector, is work alongside investors and work alongside large multinationals who are looking to operate and invest in different jurisdictions, in different countries across the world, or as is known in the consulting sector, more of the emerging markets. Now, emerging markets, when you speak about them in the language and the vocabulary or kind of democratic government and development, are countries which, to a different extent, are still undergoing democratic reforms and are still working on their democratic governance institutions. So I've had the opportunity to get some insight from how this other set of actors thinks about governance, how investors and companies, the private sector thinks and interacts with governance and with institutions in different countries. And to bring the headline, the findings at the front, I think there isn't really a straightforward dichotomy or a trade-off between the two. That governance and the quality of governance inevitably matter a lot to the private sector, to companies and investors. Profits matter, but governance matters, and increasingly more so. So it's not a straightforward dichotomy. And also, I mean, this isn't obviously very new. There's a lot of research out there, and I'm not gonna walk you through that, about how important institutions are when it comes to economic development, economic growth, as well as for the quality of democracy. So there are issues and there are factors you can look at as to kind of, if you're wondering about what may be driving both economic development and performance and democratic governance. But having said that, obviously that is not the whole story. Institutions do matter, but then the next questions are, how much do they matter? Which institutions matter? And how so? And from that, I mean, I don't have a very developed theory on this. I have few snippets and stories and case studies from what I've noticed. And these are the few thoughts that I will put to you, and I'm happy to discuss later on. So from the perspective of a private company or an investor, there are a few things that matter when it comes to governance. First thing is the predictability and the stability of both the regulatory and policy frameworks, as well as the political and security environment. I can't emphasize enough how important this is. It isn't necessarily what's in the policies and what is in those regulations, as long as they can plan around it. They can understand and plan around the risks and the opportunities that these pose. It is rather the unpredictable change, the unpredictability and frequent unannounced changes that scare off private sector actors and investors. Now, whether predictability and stability necessarily are associated with better quality governance, that's a question we can discuss. Certainly in mature democracies, you can probably see a correlation with that. But when it comes to emerging markets, I think there's a lot that we can still discuss and learn about that. The second thing, and this is again not a surprise, that the rule of law and the quality of the judiciary are very, very important. I mentioned these regulatory and policy frameworks, but what really matters is not whether they exist or how stable they are over time, but how well they're enforced. And are they enforced in an unbiased manner, or are they enforced selectively and sort of targeting certain actors more than others? This is crucial for when private sector actors decide whether to go, stay, or leave a certain country. And that is a lot of the reason that these actors come to researchers and consultants such as ourselves when they want to understand better the quality of governance, rather the rule of law and the quality of the judiciary. Now, just a couple of words about the judicial system, because it often gets forgotten or kind of afterthought, but it is crucial when it comes to enforcing contracts. And whether the local courts are competent enough, and whether they are unbiased and independent enough. Obviously, the judicial sector, the courts, are a very, very powerful pillar when it comes to the rule of law. And elections are important, as are civil society institutions, but when it comes to enforcing contracts, enforcing regulations, enforcing policy, this is where a lot of the investors will look at and will try to understand. And the final thing, which potentially should have been the first thing now that I think back, is the quality or the violability rather of property rights. This is not a surprise again, right? Property rights are really sacred to private sector actors. But beyond that, like, it isn't necessarily how well property rights are enshrined in the constitution or kind of legislation, but rather how those exceptions to property rights are done in practice. Now, there is no country in the world probably where there are there's no expropriation or exceptions that allow expropriation and nationalization of private sector assets, but how that is done, how often, how frequent, to market trades or otherwise, is another a very important aspect. Again, it's not a straightforward line, a direct line from property rights to thinking about the quality of democracy. Again, to refer to the initial question that Catherine mentioned, would a pro-authoritarian regime be better at safeguarding property rights, or a liberal democracy? It's very difficult to come to a conclusive finding on this one. But then equally, you can see how all of these actually are correlated. They do relate with the quality of democratic governance, the quality of overall governance in a country. So when it comes to the drivers of economic development to companies and investors, governance is actually a very, very important topic, and one that is becoming ever more, increasingly more important. To look at it from a different point of view, would poor governance necessarily mean no investment in a country? I think, well, the answer is no, not necessarily. But what it does mean is that the risk to investing and doing business in a country will be much higher. It'll be more expensive to do that. So in that sense, it's definitely a deterrent. It may not be a deal breaker, but it's a deterrent to doing business there. And in an environment when there's a lot of competition between governments to attract investment, that is certainly something to keep in mind. Just two short stories to finish with, really, about how the kind of overall trend governance within the investors and the private sector. We work a lot with financial sector institutions. There's development banks, or in private or investment banks, and so on. And over time, issues such as corruption, money laundering, have become more and more of an issue for them. We do a lot of work when it comes to helping these organizations understand the environment in the countries, in the markets they're looking at. This is at a kind of aggregate level, kind of macro level, but equally, even working with, say, private equity, with investors specifically looking at assets or transactions, there's a lot of due diligence that goes into pre-transactions, understanding exactly what you're dealing with, how much of exposure to corruption there is, how much of political exposure there is. And these are important things for investors. They factor that in the costs and risks when they make their decisions. And that is only likely to become more important, especially as issues such as ESG investing become more and more mainstream, and all of these factors, governance, social factors, and environmental, become part of what investors consider before they go in the market. The final story is also about multinationals, the big brands, the big companies with huge footprint on the ground. Do they exit a market when governance deteriorates? Not immediately. It's very costly to leave a country when governance deteriorates. but they do invest a lot, and I work a lot with some of them in monitoring all these changes, trying to understand what that means, and trying to draw the red line when the time is up to potentially leave a market and leave a country with all the negative consequences that that has. So mindful of time, I'm just going to conclude kind of reflecting back, can private sector actors contribute? Knowing all this, can they contribute to better democratic governance and development? There's definitely the potential for them to do that. They have the leverage to do so. Whether they do enough, I don't think so. But then it's up to all of us and governments and citizens to try to encourage them to use this leverage more so to help and pull in the same direction to improve democratic governance. I'll stop there and I'll be happy to pick up any questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cvete. And I'm very encouraged by the note that you ended on about the role of civil society in sort of interacting or interacting with these economic actors that you're talking about, precisely because, you know, this relationship between predictability and stability and democracy that we used to sort of feel pretty confident about really, in many ways, has eroded. And the authoritarian regimes have always argued that they're better placed to deliver the predictability and stability that investors seek. And, you know, some of the disastrous happenings that we've observed in countries like the United States over the last 3 or 4 years really, you know, could open the door to more authoritarian leaning actors and interests thinking that less democracy is what we need to deliver more stability. So, you know, it's really a kind of topic that almost begs more questions than it answers when we try to look to sort of what investors want as to help us out with this. So for that reason, I'm glad you brought us back to civil society organizations, and we'll continue that surely in the Q&A. But now it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Jean Scrimgeour. She is the Director for Operations and Growth at the Accountability Lab, which again deals with these citizen groups and civil society organizations that we're now hoping for so much from. So Jean, please tell us what we need to know.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Catherine. Thanks so much to the organizers and also to the other speakers. I'm actually really pleased I managed to go last because now I have all these bits and pieces I can bring up. So my name is Jean. I'm South African by birth, but live in the United States and studied actually at King's College down the road about 10 years ago. Just from my background, I worked in democracy and good governance for about 12 years now, primarily in the Global South, and working mostly on issues around how to get citizen participation or citizens to participate in the governance space. Because I think what Cvete was saying was so important where you have business. I think that I think there are all these different actors that need to play nicely to make the system work. And so often we cede as citizens, we cede our responsibility to a government or to a business or to a sort of even an election or even to another civil society organization. And I think that what I really want to talk about today is how citizens can participate, whether it be through different spaces and places. I also really wanted to answer the question in particular, so I'm sort of going to shape my conversation through that. I work for the Accountability Lab. We're a global translocal network. It's a new word for us, but we're a global translocal network of civil society organizations that are based in Mali, Pakistan, Liberia, Nigeria, South Africa, Nepal, Mexico, Somaliland, and the DRC. And I think for us, what we're trying to do is really look at how we can make governance work for people by supporting active citizens, responsible leaders, and building accountable institutions. And I think that for us, governance and democracy is really about building all three of those simultaneously. You can't have one without the other. For us, democracy means, or no, wait, not so much democracy, but for us, our goal is a world in which resources are used wisely, decisions benefit everyone fairly, and people can lead secure lives. As a result, I think based on some of the questions, for us, it's not so much about the form of democracy, but more, or the governance system, but rather about the function that they play. So whether you're a liberal democracy or a social democracy or a federation or a republic, either is fine. It's just, does it function in a way that creates spaces for people to participate and engage and create this sort of ability to lead a secure life and receive the resources that government or that, you know, that the state has to provide. So again, participation is key. But this does not mean that if you do not live in a democratic state, you are not able to participate. I think participation takes various forms and can take various spaces in different levels. We work in some of the most complex places in the world, and we've managed to create a fair amount of participation of citizens, even in places like the Ségou region in Mali, which is one of the most unsafe places in the world. And we do this through really looking at ways of building unlikely networks. So it's how can you bring different people into the democracy and governance space in order to create safe spaces for people to operate. So maybe we're not necessarily going to talk about elections per se, but maybe we're going to talk about the water that we really need to receive in order for our farms to work. A lot of those conversations have accountability bases, and by having a simple conversation about water, you can often lead to a more complex conversation about elections and good governance and participation. The other thing is also really, and I think this sort of leads back to part of the conversation that I think you were having, Richard, was we need to make sure that we are feeding information back. I think governments are often very extractive. I think business is often extractive. I think civil society can be extractive, but how are we empowering, which is a word I don't like to use very much, citizens to actually participate, but with the appropriate information that they need so that they can really address the issues that are important. Again, democracy is not so much about elections or about, you know, good governance. It's about being able to on the very basic level, receive the resources that you need to be able to survive and prosper and flourish. So I think even in non-democracies and local communities have in many places created very unique spaces for civic participation and holding their governments to account on issues that they care about. And I can give you a ream of examples and I'll put a bunch of links in, but I think that there's some really cool things around natural resource management in Liberia, some stuff around civic countering violent extremism with young men in Mali, and some really cool stuff about women participation in healthcare in Pakistan, which has, even in its little space, created a larger sort of ripple effect around governance. I think then sort of going to the second point, democracy and good governance do not necessarily mean that financial prosperity will be undermined. And I think this is sort of, I think what Cvete was saying is often sustainable, that democratic spaces or spaces in which people can participate are frequently more sustainable. Right now, they may not seem as financially prosperous or able to move and be as agile as is required by some fiscal system. But authoritarian regimes are known for being notoriously corrupt and incredibly ineffective. And good governance and stable financial systems require effective public servants. it requires stable institutions, I think as Cvete said, it requires predictability. And authoritarian regimes are notoriously unpredictable. And so I think for us, again, it's really about how do we, on a local level, create those predictabilities, those sustainable sort of systems that allow for people to, have resources that are used wisely and have decisions that benefit everyone. And so what we do is we have a little campaign called Integrity Icon, where we name and fame honest civil servants. And it's based on a concept of positive deviance, where if you can create safe spaces around, and if you can highlight people that are doing the right thing when no one's watching, and create safe spaces around them, then often you create something for people to emulate. And again, this is a campaign that's really fun. It's sort of based on American Idol, but just as an aside, we received a cease and desist from actual American Idol for besmirching their name. So now we're called Integrity Icon, where we name and fame honest civil servants. And I think for that, again, what we're doing is we're trying to focus on positivity, not negativity, and build and equip these reformers, even if they're on the lower level, for collective action to shift norms and change behaviors. And so, just to sort of, as my last little bit, I think let's really look at how we can focus on things like economic development, not specifically being about how fast things are, economic development is often seen in a very short arc. And I think if we can look at it over a more longitudinal space, we can see that actually authoritarian regimes in the end very seldom function. Look at Egypt, look at the South African apartheid government, massively bankrupt and could not sustain itself, even though on the outside it looked really effective. And we've got to be careful that we don't just recreate these enormous elites, by saying, hey, these authoritarian regimes are so great, look how functional they are. But actually, at the end of the day, it's so few people that have money. But instead, let's really focus on how we can create participation of ordinary people so that they can influence the policies and processes that are required for sustainable good governance.
Jean, thank you so much. It's really interesting that you've kind of drawn this line between participation and, let's say, the economy, but economic development with a small d, just really in terms of very local situations of, people just say trying to maintain the safety of their societies in conflictual situations, or to maintain shared resources that they depend on sort of in a very local way without necessarily being connected up to the largest issues of pressuring government at the national level or change in regime types. Well, we have 20 minutes and there are about 35 people here on our Zoom platform, and there's many questions filling up the Q&A. I have one kind of general question that I would like to ask to get us started, and I'm kind of pulling off of what some of the people have asked in the Q&A sidebar here. There's been quite a bit of talk about civil society organizations and citizen activism, and it seems like, at all levels, in terms of, maintaining the democratic nature of our societies and political systems, maybe even in contributing to election security, but also, sort of in building those accountability mechanisms in democratic or not so democratic settings that help keep leaders accountable to even CSO or local participation, just, you know, to make local communities and resource sharing work. And some of the questions that I have and that appear in the sidebar are really, what is the role of, well, so the general question, where do these come from? Or maybe more specifically, what is the role of outside organizations like, you know, the United Nations Support Mission in Libya now that's there to prepare the ground for future elections, but how can that kind of organization support local citizen groups or civil society organizations? How can sort of the international community support the kind of cultivation of participatory citizenship at the grassroots? And the paradox is that, you know, traditionally in theory, and I think Richard invoked some of this kind of theory, these kinds of citizen activist organizations emerge endogenously, you know, out of sort of characteristics of the society itself, whether it's, you know, a middle class or education or people with time and resources, you know. So how are civil society organizations nurtured? That's one question I would like to put out for the group at large, and maybe more specifically for some of the speakers who focus more on political systems. How do these organizations support election integrity and some of the basic mechanisms for making democratic government work? So that's my question. Maybe if I can maybe turn it briefly over to the panelists and let you respond to each other, and maybe this question, 1 or 2 minutes each, and then I'll take some of the questions directly from the floor. So shall we start with Cvete? Do you want to start, maybe respond to the other panelists or these issues?
Sure. I will step away now from my role as the head of political risk and security analysis and just comment on it, just with my researcher's hat on. Right, what's the role of external actors, international organizations or others in the quality of democratic reforms? And inevitably, they play a role. Whether they play a positive role and you know, what, in which areas that is, whether that shows in the quality of elections or in the quality of political participation or otherwise, that will depend. Now, my experience is from researching the Balkans, and this will, you know, what I give will be based on my research in the Balkans. I think, and keep my biases in mind, obviously, I've researched 2 power sharing countries there, Macedonia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. I think potentially the largest impact is on the design of the political system itself, because that really underpins everything that follows afterwards. It is the kind of primary question of what is this state and who are we as the citizens of that state? How do we articulate our political interests and how they compete in the political sphere? And this really, in my, again, kind of regionally, geographically limited experience, is driving a lot of the issues with governance in these countries, especially in the post-conflict context. So everything that comes after, whether it's, you know, assisting specific development programs or local CSOs, you know, local ownership of reforms has been a big kind of phrase that's been used a lot in the Balkans. It's all about local ownership, you know, whether it's in Kosovo, getting the institutions to the local people, or winding up the EU's, and before that, the UN's missions in Bosnia. It's all about local ownership. But I think all of that really will stem from getting the primary thing right, which is the nature of the political system and political competition there. And there's loads of issues with how power sharing is structured in these countries, which is not the topic of tonight's discussion. But I think if I could choose where, if there was a limited pot of resources, money, human or otherwise, I would focus that on getting the first principles right of political organization and competition, and then hoping that will multiply later on. stop there.
Richard.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, I just realized my window's open. Let's close that to keep the noise down. Sorry, I realized I'm polluting everyone's noise space. There's some really interesting questions that have come up, and to try and answer them really quickly. How do we stop CSOs from becoming commercial organizations and commercialized? A lot of it comes through the selection process. When we put out requests for proposals from civil society organizations, when we bring them back, when we start assessing what it is they're doing, one of the things that I look for is if an organization is 100% take, then my potential for approving them is going to be limited. If they're giving me something and then asking for something else on top, I'm much more likely to be inclined to award a grant to them. Also within that, most grants are tranche-based. So you don't give 3 years of funding to somebody in one go. You drip feed it in an increase if they are successful. There was a question on Libya. Thank you. It's almost making the point that I believe I was trying to argue for. But the question was, why aren't the UN giving support to CSOs? Well, it's probably not within their mandate. My experience of working on elections is that UN do the heavy lifting on elections technical. They are usually the source through which all the materials and resources are purchased. The operational support is given. A lot of the training is developed. There are other organizations out there who build CSO capacity around elections. The US use a system called CEPS. I forget what it stands for. It will come to me later. They look at 3 major not-for-profits. IFAS, the Independent Foundation for Electoral Systems, NDI, the National Democratic Institute, IRI, the International Republican Institute. IFAS do capacity building of the election management body. NDI do the building of CSOs for domestic observation, and IRI tend to do political parties. On the EU side, European Centre for Electoral Support, the organization that I'm working with. In Ethiopia, we are working on preventing electoral violence. That's a CSO-based program. We're also working with the European response to electoral cycle support, which is technical capacity building. Very similar, we work hand in glove with IFAS. There are significant funding pools from USAID, from the EU, from FCDO that go to build civil society capacity, from, I don't know, how to do local WASH programs through to minority rights, building access for people with disabilities into government offices, all this type of thing. There's lots of money out there, and a lot of it is developed through CSOs. And Catherine's looking at me now saying, I need to shut up, so I will, and I'll go back to mute. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Jacopo, are you still here? I'd like to ask you to pick up on your final point about the role of citizen activism and participation in helping to sustain the quality of democracies in the countries that you were mainly referring to. Is Jacopo still here?
I think he has left the panel due to Wi-Fi issues, so he may rejoin in a few seconds. Yeah. Maybe someone else can answer the question in the meantime.
Yeah, I think Jean was talking about sort of very local level initiatives. One question that I have then for all of you is what can be the role of civil society in situations of that are very authoritarian? I mean, Jean was talking about the space for local participation, and Richard's been talking about civil society organizations, and Cvete also about the importance of citizen activism and institutional design. But isn't that sort of the very paradox of authoritarian regimes, is that the space is closed or very much narrowed for this kind of activity? I mean, are we in a kind of chicken and the egg type of conversation here, not unlike the democracy and development chicken and egg that, you know, we sort of started with in discussing regime type. I don't know, Jean, do you want to come in on that?
Necessarily. I mean, we work in Balochistan, we work in Segu, we have a project in Iran. And I think, you know, we've actually managed to work on these sorts of things, but the key is, don't just go out there and saying, we're looking to make democracy. There are lots of different ways that you can go about it, and lots of different ways that you can have conversations about accountability issues and even anti-corruption issues without ever actually using the word democracy or anti-corruption. And sometimes this is through music, sometimes it's through art. We've got a very, very big project in Zimbabwe. And, you know, Zimbabwe is currently a bastion for authoritarianism, and we're managing to function just fine. You know, and it's really about how do we get people to understand that the issue that is irritating them right now, or that's making their lives difficult, like the roads that just aren't working and the collapsed healthcare systems and the fact that there's no food, is actually often an accountability and democratic governance issue. But if you can sort of start very small and work on this sort of direct, sort of like, let's start working on these issues on a smaller level and not on this giant macro level, you create safe spaces for people to operate, you create ways for people to collectively engage. I mean, I think COVID has been fascinating because for the first time, you now have a bunch of authoritarian leaders who traditionally would have just flown to the UK or Canada or the US or Singapore or Hong Kong or whatever to go and get their healthcare. Now they're stuck in their own countries having to use their own failed healthcare systems. So you have kids of authoritarian leaders who are starting to have conversations about how this failed. Zimbabwe in particular, who's a very, very well-known guy who was very high up in the government, whose child died because of COVID and because there was no sort of oxygen. Traditionally, this kid would have just been flown to South Africa or somewhere else. And I just wanted to just quickly pick up the point on civil society. Civil society is very big business if you are a big international NGO. Their overheads are very, very high. It's very, very complex to manage these incredibly complex USAID deferred grants, and requires an enormous amount of overhead to be able to handle them. So civil society often fail just because they aren't able to sustain the very complex structural bits and pieces that are required to even receive money in the first place.
Right. Actually, there's a question in the chat box that kind of asks us to pop back up to that level. And, you know, there's a question here from Nicole saying, you know, shouldn't we be looking maybe to peace builders and construction of the state in some of these very difficult and complicated situations of great even insecurity on the ground, before we talk about civil society or before we talk about, you know, spaces for participation? Is there really a sort of sequencing or logical priors that...
I can jump in for 30 seconds. So I'm a peace builder by trade, actually. And actually, often conflict is based on people's inability to access resources. So people's inability to access food, water, healthcare, general basic living things that make them survive. And the most dangerous human being in the whole world is a parent who cannot feed their child when their parents couldn't feed them either. There is a hopelessness that comes with that. And what comes with that is, and that's also, Amartya Sen has that, like, value capabilities versus value expectations. And if your expectations are high and you can't make a better life than the life that you had, you are much more likely to take to the streets and cause a lot of havoc and mayhem. And It's really about how do we deal with those sorts of Maslow hierarchy of needs, sustainability issues, before we even get to macro peace building level stuff.
Unfortunately, I think that's true. I mean, Richard, I mean, you are someone who's, let's say, seen both sides or all sides of this also. What is your perspective?
I very much agree with Jean. They, you know, start with the basics. I forget who it was. It's sometimes attributed to Napoleon. I challenge you to anger a man with a full stomach. You know, the counter to that that's just been, you know, so I challenge you to calm down an angry mother who can't feed her child or get basic medical care. If we look at some of the major revolutions that have occurred, Yemen, Sudan, these have been led by angry youth and angry women who are fed up of the male patriarchy taking everything for themselves, and they've just reached breaking point and they've said, we've had enough. And it's a lesson for the UK as well. We've got a lot of angry people that don't have a form of representation. So, you know, democracy is not just the stuff that we export. We also need to be looking at home and looking at our own civil society organizations and the absence of people without disposable income because we've been wrapped up in student debt, in mortgages, in car payments, and payday loans. And nobody's got any free time because of the society that we've created around ourselves. And we have a failing democracy at home. Sorry, I'm rambling on and getting away from the subject.
Actually, I was hoping that Jacopo would be here to create an opportunity to turn the conversation back to our own, you know, back to the societies that we're all living in right now, those of us, most of us on this platform, and the role of civic activism and civil society organizations maybe in helping to make robust the quality of our own democracy. So I think Richard's just raised this topic. You know, the speakers on this platform have observed, you know, really both sides of this, sort of the best and the worst of this kind of social order. I'm glad we've come back to this issue at the end. I'd like to give, I think we have 2 minutes. So unfortunately not time to dwell on the issue, but I'd like to give Cvete the floor again to maybe give us her wisdom on this issue, and then just leave a few seconds for each of our other panelists to come back in.
Thanks, Catherine. I mean, I'm obviously not an expert in civil society and civil participation. It goes a little bit beyond you know, my research and professional expertise, but I did want to offer a couple of thoughts when you raised the issue of the chicken and egg with the kind of narrowing space for civil society, whether that's a precursor or is it just a consequence. And I think, again, from a researcher's point of view, I think a narrow space for civil society really is a prerequisite for changing governance and changing or overthrowing or reforming authoritarian government. If there was enough space for it, then a lot of our needs, social or basic or otherwise, would have been met. So that is, in that sense, I think that comes first. Whether that helps or doesn't help, then with the project of improving democracy and governance, obviously is up for discussion. I think what I would put there, just for thought, is that while it may seem that authoritarian regimes kind of completely colonize and fill all the space in the state, in practice, they're very quick to crumble when the time comes. Now, I don't know when the time comes, right? That's the big question. What explains timing with revolutions and change? But I think that narrow space is just only seemingly that narrow. These authoritarian regimes, the more or even the less authoritarian, they're very quick to crumble, and then you are left with all this empty space. And that is where civil society can then take over. And if you did have the roots of that, then they're in a very good position to very quickly expand. So these are just obviously no conclusions, but it's kind of the initial thoughts on that from what I have researched and seen. And I'll stop there and let the others offer their concluding.
Well, actually, we're in our last minute, and I know one of our organizers, Cheryl Lowe, wants to get the very last final word. Richard, can give us one sentence? Just.
To thank Jean for a comment on complexity, which leads to overhead, which leads to a lack of interest from donors to do it. We have to make our processes less complex in how we build civil society organizations. Thank you. And thank you to everyone else.
Yep. Jean, one sentence, please.
Thank you very much to everyone. And please, remember that civil society also has its own politics.
Good point. Cheryl, I'm turning the floor back over to you.
Thank you so much to all our panelists who have taken time today to join us this evening. It was an amazing, amazing panel, and I'm very sure all the attendees have agreed as well. So the end of this panel concludes the end of this year's London Development Symposium. So spending 4 days with 4 panels and a workshop led by Shamonis and Unleashed this afternoon, we are so glad that so many people have enjoyed them and managed to learn so much from these sessions. So to all the attendees, thank you so much for joining us and being part of this symposium and making all of this discussion so invaluable. The London Development Symposium committee hopes that you have all gained so much from these 4 days, and this is not the end. We hope that you bring all these ideas and the discussions from the conference to help develop new ideas and spur action on your end. So once again, thank you so much for all our panelists and for everybody who have come down to contribute to this fantastic discussion and debate. We hope that we will see you again next year. And if you have any suggestions, inquiries, please do drop us a message on our emails. So that is all for this year. Stay safe, healthy, and have an amazing weekend. So thank you so much, everybody, and we will see you again next year.
Thank you for bringing us together. Thank you. Bye. Thanks to everyone.